Now let's get more on that really important breaking story that the US has immediately lifted its pause on intelligence sharing with Ukraine. Here is Marco Rubio and Mark Waltz, the Secretary of State, talking about the agreement from Jeddah.
Well, just to add to the Secretary's comments, the Ukrainian delegation today made something very clear, that they share President Trump's vision for peace. They share his determination to end the fighting, to end the killing, to end the tragic kind of meat grinder of people and national treasure that's happening on the front in Ukraine. Number one. Number two, they made concrete steps and concrete proposals, not only accepting our proposal for a full ceasefire, which you can see the details of which are in our joint statement that we released together. But we also got into substantive details on how this war is going to permanently end.
So all that happening amidst the peace talks going on in Jeddah, which are still shrouded in some mystery. Nowhere will be watching with more anxiety and hope than Kyiv, from where Sam Kiley, the international editor of The Independent, joins us now. Sam, very dramatic news there, and it suggests that the Americans have not heard from the Russians anything they wanted to, and are therefore, as it were, tilting it a little bit back towards Ukraine.
Well, I think it's slightly wishful thinking, to be honest, and it shows just how far the window of opportunity and possibility has been moved by the Trump administration. I mean, the only concrete thing to have come out, Andrew, is that the Americans have agreed to not continue to blind the Ukrainian intelligence office effort, which is actually about defending civilians as well as prosecuting combat operations.
But also also to restore arms as well, I think. I read just now.
Security cooperation there. It's not clear there yet. Okay. I think there's a lot. But what has happened is that the Americans have been much cheered up by the Ukrainians, clearly, in this very successful, from the Ukrainian perspective, diplomatic effort to bring the Americans not back on their side at all, but back into an environment in which they're talking to each other. Remember, these are talks between the United States and Ukraine, not between Ukraine and Vladimir Putin's team. And at the moment, it still looks as if the Americans are essentially representing the Putin position, and now they're going to take what they've gathered or agreed with the Ukrainians, maybe onto the Russians. But if we look at what they've decided here, Andrew, they're taking important steps towards creating an environment for peace. They are agreeing to future dispensation talk about the minerals deal. So these are getting talks between Ukraine and the US back on track. But I think absolutely critical here is the agreement, apparent agreement from the Ukrainian side to the principle behind a 30-day ceasefire. That's an enormous gamble for the Ukrainians, because it gives the Russians an opportunity, both sides an opportunity, to rearm and rest and retrain and reconfigure. But the Ukrainians don't have that depth of support which they would have had from the Russians, which would have meant that a ceasefire meant that the breather could be used to reinforce their positions and mean that they can extract a decent proposal from their perspective from the Russians going in future.
Yes. Well, Sam, as we're talking, the news continues to evolve. Reuters are indeed reporting that Ukraine has agreed to accept that US proposal for an immediate 30-day ceasefire and to take steps towards restoring a durable peace. Now, I spoke to President Zelensky just before he left the UK on his recent visit, and he was very, very vehement and eloquent about how he was against this kind of ceasefire, how it would just help the Russians and not Ukraine. So do you think that he and his team have been effectively forced into this?
I don't think there's any question that they've been forced into this. They have had both hands shoved up behind their backs in that incident in the Oval Office, but also in the whole attitude of the United States, which across a wide range of areas has undermined the ability to the Ukrainians to prosecute a war against the Russians and to defend themselves. And so they are also have been under enormous pressure from the Europeans. The Europeans could potentially step in and fill some of the gaps left by the Americans' withdrawal, but they can't do it immediately. So I think what we're seeing here is a Zelensky buying some time, a 30-day pause. I've spoken to a lot of Ukrainians about this idea of a ceasefire before this particular meeting, and they all said that they're very concerned about a ceasefire because it takes a lot of the energy out of their effort. It is seen as corroding to their war effort. And at the end of the day, the Russians have got a very, very, very bad record for breaching ceasefires in the past. Dozens and dozens of times they've breached ceasefires in the past. And so that we will then, the danger is you get into an opportunity for Donald Trump to constantly blame the Ukrainians for every ceasefire violation.
Well, they certainly violated the Minsk agreement ceasefire back in, 2014, I think 25 times or something. And what we haven't heard yet is any real indication of Moscow's thinking. I've read that the Americans are sending a delegation to Moscow pretty soon. Again, what are people saying in Kyiv about what they expect Putin to do?
Well, they expect Putin to be delighted with this development. It gives him the opportunity when, in fact, his economy has been very, very badly affected by this. The energy of the Russian attacks, Ukrainians are telling me, in the east in particular, has drastically reduced. Their logistics chain has been under severe pressure. So if he has 30 days of peace, of no more air attacks from the Ukrainians, the likes of which we've seen a big demonstration of in the last 24 hours with this massive attack across Russia, even hitting strategic oil lines supplying fuel into European countries like Slovakia. So the Ukrainians can't do that and the Russians can repair it. Then when, not if, hostilities return, I think the Ukrainian attitude will be the Russians will be in a stronger position. Whatever may be emerging in terms of positive vibrations out of Jeddah between the Americans and the Ukrainians, this will be seen as a pretty close to a betrayal and certainly as a gamble with their future over this ceasefire deal.
A desperate mood still in Kyiv. Sam, thank you very much indeed for talking to me. Now, the more they talk peace, the more they make war, or so it seems. Heading for the Trump-choreographed Ukraine peace talks we've just been talking about, the Russians had launched a massive attack with drones and missiles on Ukraine's infrastructure, killing 3 civilians. And last night, tit for tat, Ukraine hit Moscow with her drones, killing 2 civilians. For some people, tensions between the West and Russia now haven't been so high since the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962. The Soviet leader at the time was Nikita Khrushchev. To get her view on the situation now, let's go to Professor Nina Khrushchev, his great-granddaughter, who is, as it happens, Professor of International Affairs at the New School in New York City. Professor, thank you very much indeed for joining us tonight. What is your reading of the next likely move by Moscow?
Hi. Well, Moscow is waiting. Putin has been, your previous guest said that, in a pretty good position because it does seem that the Americans is almost negotiating on the Kremlin behalf. So Putin is waiting. This immediate ceasefire for 30 days. We haven't heard the Russian reaction yet, so we don't know exactly what their conditions or what their acceptance is going to be or not. But because of this very giant drone strike on Russia last night, which I think it was about 330 drones, up to 10 people, it's not 2, it's up to 10 people were killed in those strikes. So Putin has very little time to see whether he would indeed agree to this ceasefire right now, because they would want to retaliate. I think they're itching to retaliate. And so the question is whether they would want some long-term strategic goal in general changing and kind of changing their position and getting to the peace talks, or they are going to continue to fight and pay back to Ukraine, which I think in many ways is exactly what Ukrainians are hoping for, that Putin is not going to agree ultimately because he wants to take his forces further. And that's why the Russians would be the first to break it. And therefore, Ukraine will continue not to be defeated.
This is the real problem that Donald Trump has. Neither side seems very, very keen to stop this war at the moment. But it's also clear that what Vladimir Putin wants is effectively a helpless rump Ukraine, not particularly well defended or protected by anybody, and preferably with a client puppet leader. I don't see any sign of that changing soon, do you?
No, and not, and it won't, I mean, Putin is a pretty consistent guy. So he said that there are certain things he doesn't want from Ukraine, or Ukraine to be. That is a platform for potentially serving as a tech place for NATO forces against Russia. He doesn't want Ukraine to be part of NATO and so on. He wants it to demilitarize and other things. And so that has not changed. And I don't think it is going to change. Although I do think that Putin, if conditions work for him, I think he may agree that there could be some ceasefire, because Ukraine is in a very vulnerable position. And so he would not mind if Ukraine is going to end the war in this vulnerable position. Russia keeps the territory that it has and then negotiate over the fact that, okay, let's promise that you're not going to join NATO and basically become a country within continue to be in our sphere of influence, and we are not going to go further. That is potentially possible, and I think that's what Donald Trump is counting on, because he wants this war ended. He doesn't want to pay for it.
Yeah, and I'm scrabbling at the edge of my historical memory here, Professor, but I can't help remembering, I think, that your own great-grandfather's family came originally from Ukraine, one of many, many Soviet leaders with Ukrainian background as well. In that context, can you maybe explain to people listening why, for many Russians, Ukraine is really part of Greater Russia and has been for a very long time?
Thank you. That's a very long conversation. Actually, Khrushchev did not come from Ukraine. He was a Russian in the Kursk region. In fact, the region where Ukrainian forces
next to Ukraine,
next to Ukraine. Which now has been under parts of it under Ukrainian control for 7 months. Ukraine. If you translate it from the Russian, Ukraine is a country on the edge of Russia, sort of, and in other linguistic terms, it's also called the small Russia. So, in this sense, Ukraine has been part of, or some parts in certain spaces, part of the Russian Empire for centuries, and so Russians do see it as a great sphere of influence for itself. And a lot of, by the way, a lot of secretaries of the Communist Party were